Hello, and welcome to today's presentation on functional behavior assessment and functional analyses. Today's presentation will be covering pages 628 through 634 from the Cooper, Huron, and Heward textbook, chapter 27. And then we'll also be discussing the Iwata and Dozier clinical applications of FBA methodology. Really, we're mostly going to just be going over a brief overview of functional behavior assessment and then functional analyses as well. So the TCO items that we'll be covering in today's lecture will be F6, which is to implement functional assessment of behavior, including indirect, descriptive, and experimental analyses. The objectives, as I just mentioned earlier, for today's lecture are to introduce functional behavior assessment and to learn about functional analyses. I do want to mention that in today's lecture, it's mostly going to be an overview. You'll learn a little bit about each of these types of assessments, but there's much more that goes into them, and so you'll learn about that in another course. So before we get started with today's lecture, I want to make sure that we do a review of the content that we've already covered in previous lectures, just to make sure that you're able to tie everything in together. So I talked about what we should do at the onset of ABA services in a previous lecture, and this is something that ties into what we're going to be discussing today about functional behavior assessments and functional analyses. So today's question, the first question is, which of these should you do at the outset of ABA services? I am asking this because I want to make sure that you're not forgetting what you learned in previous lectures, and rather that I want to work on tying all these things together for you and painting the picture of what the process looks like from the onset of ABA services to when we finally, intervene on a client's behavior. Okay, so which of these do we do at the outset of service? Do we obtain informed consent from stakeholders, begin intervention immediately, and implement reinforcement schedules? Do we review client records, identify socially significant goals, and obtain informed consent from stakeholders? Do we gather baseline data, develop an intervention plan, and implement reinforcement schedules without stakeholder input? Or do we conduct assessments, review client records, and identify socially significant goals without obtaining informed consent? So I'll give you a moment to answer this question, and then we'll review the question. Okay, so the question is asking us, what do we do at the outset of services? The correct answer here is B. We should be reviewing client records, identifying socially significant goals that we would want to work on with our client, and obtain informed consent from stakeholders prior to intervening on any behavior. There might be another answer that you may have thought of selecting, and it was answer option A, and it says obtain informed consent from stakeholders, which is correct. It is something that we do. The next one says begin intervention immediately, and this is, and then the last one says and implement reinforcement schedules. The reason that this is not the correct answer is that it says to begin intervention immediately. We don't begin intervention immediately at the outset of services. We have to make sure that we do other things first, such as review client records or making sure that we're selecting goals that are appropriate for that client or that we can understand what that client's needs are. And so that's why this is incorrect. You may have a client that might be interested in immediately jumping in and getting started, but that's not what we do. Instead, we want to make sure that we are conducting an assessment to get a sense for what that client's needs are prior to making any modifications to their behavior. We want to make sure that we have like a clear picture of what their baseline is, to what extent are they engaging in the specific behaviors prior to intervention getting started. Okay, so after you have reviewed the client records and you have a sense for what that client needs to work on, we'll conduct our behavioral assessment. Our next question says, what outcomes can you expect from a behavioral assessment? So please go ahead and take a moment to answer this question. Okay, so hopefully you've answered the question and you know what you should expect from a behavioral assessment, and we'll review that now. So when you conduct a behavioral assessment, we can expect to identify target behaviors to work on with our particular client, whether it be behaviors that we want to target for increase or for decrease, right? We mentioned that people engage in adaptive behaviors or maladaptive behaviors, and that behavioral assessment will help us to figure out what those adaptive behaviors are and their maladaptive behaviors, which will lead us to identification of potential goals to work on. Now let's review one final question before we get started with the meat and potatoes of today's lecture. So this question says, which term corresponds to the following definition? And it says, the extent to which target behaviors, intervention procedures, and outcomes are socially significant, acceptable, and meaningful to the individual and their stakeholders. So which term corresponds with this? Please take a moment to answer this question. Okay, the correct answer here is social validity. Our answer options were functional assessment, social validity, behavior intervention plan, and positive reinforcement. The correct answer is social validity. And as we reviewed, social validity is something that we should be measuring and assessing throughout our behavior assessment, right? The development of our goals, the selection of our goals. And then once we get to the portion of developing our intervention plan, we want to make sure that we are also assessing social validity there. And we also want to assess how effective our treatment results were, okay? So social validity is something that we should be assessing throughout the entire process of our time servicing a client. Okay, so hopefully I've painted a pretty clear picture for you of what the different steps of servicing a client might look like. I mentioned the outset of services. I mentioned conducting the behavioral assessment to get a sense for what their skills are and where their deficits are. And then hopefully being able to identify certain goals to work on. And then now, what's the next step? Typically, the next step would be intervention. But really that just depends on what our clients' needs are. So for some clients, a behavioral assessment, a general behavioral assessment will be enough. And for some clients, it won't, because we may have clients that are engaging in maladaptive behaviors or problem behaviors or challenging behaviors, however you want to refer to those different behaviors as. You'll hear the different terms. You will hear the term maladaptive behavior. You'll hear oh my goodness, it's like a tongue twister. You will hear the term challenging behavior or problem behavior, referencing all these different types of behaviors that don't contribute in a positive way to the client's life. And so these are behaviors that typically we want to target for reduction in order to improve that client's quality of life in some way. Okay, so this could be behaviors, for example, I guess we could use this visual here, maybe making fun of their peers or hitting a peer, not being able to share with a peer, or maybe knocking things down when a peer is playing with them. It could be other things too, like for example, like aggression, maybe eating things that you're not supposed to be eating, that non-edible objects, for example. It could be things such as, elopement, so like leaving a particular area when it's not safe to do so. Maybe getting off task when you're supposed to be working. There are many different behaviors that can be considered maladaptive behaviors. It really depends on each client, their environment, and what they're expected to be doing or what will help them be successful in that environment. But a maladaptive behavior is really just based on an individual, independent basis. We consider it like behaviors that are disrupting a person's daily functioning or their interactions with others, or participation in their daily activities. So it really just depends on the client, their context, the environment in which they're in, their expectations, etc. So the big question here is, what do we do when a client is engaging in maladaptive behaviors? And the big question is, we have to identify what the function of their behavior is. So this is content that you covered in a previous course, but before we start talking more in depth about function of behavior and assessing function of behavior and all of that, I want to make sure that you guys know what the function of behavior is. So please take a moment to answer the question, what is function? Okay, so function of behavior is basically the reason why a person engages in a particular behavior, or the rationale for a behavior. So as I mentioned, it's the why of behavior. What we're really looking at in terms of function is the consequence that's maintaining a particular behavior, okay? The next question for you guys is, and this is again a review, it should be review content because it's something that you learned in EAB 3002, but just in case you don't remember, that's why we're going over it in today's lecture. Because I want to make sure that we can tie everything together and that I'm not just assuming that because you've learned this before, you maybe have retained the information or that you are very fluent in the information. So we're going to review it all again today. So list the functions of behavior. Okay, so we have different functions of behavior. We have behavior that is maintained by positive reinforcement, and then we have behavior that is maintained by negative reinforcement. Our behavior that is maintained by positive and negative reinforcement is classified in different ways, and you'll hear these different functions of behavior labeled in a different way depending on the textbook that you're reading or the person that you're speaking to. And so I'll try to expose you to all of that different language so that you are able to, maybe answer different types of questions depending on the source that they're coming from, or if you read a different textbook, you know exactly what they're referring to. So our forms of positive reinforcement are social positive reinforcement, which is like, for example, behavior that is occurring to gain access to attention. It is a form of positive reinforcement. It's considered a social positive reinforcement because to gain attention, you need to have an interaction with an individual. And so that's why it's classified social positive reinforcement. Okay, so you will hear some people say the function of the behavior is social positive reinforcement, or you'll hear some other people say the function of the behavior is attention or to gain access to attention, whether it be from an adult, a peer, whoever it may be. Okay, so it's important to know the two different ways that you may hear that referenced. The next form of positive reinforcement is tangible reinforcement. Okay, and this is behavior that is maintained by access to some form of tangibles, items, or maybe activities. It might not be a physical item. It could be an activity that a person wants to engage in and wants to gain access to. It could be, like, for example, food. It could be water. It really can be any different thing. When you hear tangible reinforcement, it doesn't have to be just a specific item. It can be any of these different things I just mentioned previously. Okay, then we have automatic positive reinforcement, and automatic positive reinforcement can be like those individuals that engage in particular behavior to gain access to some sensory input or some sensory stimulation, or there's some form of automatic reinforcement that they gain from engaging in a particular behavior. So for example, a person that twirls their hair might twirl their hair because of the sensation that they get on their hands, or like the addition of that stimulus of some stimulus on their hand, right? Like their hair rubbing through their hands. Maybe it's a particular sensory input that they enjoy. And so the function of the behavior would be to engage in the behavior and gain access to this automatic reinforcement or the sensory input that they're getting through their hands. We also have automatic negative reinforcement. So this would be behaviors such as like scratching, to relieve some form of discomfort could be an example of automatic negative reinforcement. So they engage in the particular behavior of scratching, and what they gain is relief. It's automatically reinforcing for them. It doesn't require any particular individual to provide that stimulation or remove that stimulation, right? The itch. It's something that they can deliver themselves. Okay, then we also have social negative reinforcement, which is also typically people will refer to this as escape or avoidance behaviors, or behaviors that are maintained by escape or behaviors that are maintained by avoidance. These are behaviors that people engage in order to escape or avoid a particular stimulus. So there's some stimulus in the environment that is removed after they engage in some particular behavior. An example of this could be engaging in a tantrum to get out of doing homework, okay? Or another example of this could be, let's say you see you're walking down a hallway and you see your an ex-boyfriend or something, and you don't want to interact with them, and so you turn around and you walk in the opposite direction. That's an example of social negative reinforcement. You are avoiding a stimulus that was present in the environment by turning around and walking away, and so you don't have to come into contact with that particular stimulus. And that behavior, that reinforcer, of not coming into contact with that particular stimulus will reinforce your behavior in the future. Okay, and so it's very important that we identify functions of behavior before we intervene on the particular behavior, so that we are able to identify interventions that are going to be effective at reducing that particular behavior. If we don't know the why of the behavior or the function of the behavior, how can we possibly develop an intervention that's going to be effective at reducing it? We could, hypothetically speaking, put random interventions into place and hope and wish that the behavior will reduce. But we're a science-based field, and we have evidence-based practices. We have conducted plenty of research to know which interventions are likely to be effective for the different functions of behavior, right? To address behaviors that occur for different reasons. And so identifying the function of behavior is going to be the first thing that we want to attempt to do when we are faced with a client that's engaging in some form of maladaptive behavior. And it's important to note that all behavior, right, not just maladaptive behaviors, but all behaviors, whether it's adaptive or maladaptive, are going to be maintained by some form of reinforcement. If the behavior is occurring in a person's repertoire, then that behavior serves a function. There's some function, some variable in the consequence that's maintaining that behavior over time. And we can sit and conduct a functional analysis of that particular behavior to understand what those contingencies that are maintaining that behavior are, okay? So every single behavior, whether it be something as simple as washing your hands or some maladaptive behavior like screaming or hitting yourself, etc., all of these different behaviors are reinforced by some particular variable in the environment, and we can identify those particular variables if we were to conduct some analysis, some functional analysis of behavior, okay? Or a functional assessment of behavior. So that leads me into our discussion on today's lecture, which is functional behavior assessments. Or you'll hear the term functional behavior assessments is the long name. You'll also hear people say FBAs. In behavior analysis, we use a lot of these acronyms, and so it's important for you to know both of these. Okay, so FBAs are systematic assessments that we conduct in behavior analysis that will help us to identify those functions of the behavior or those maintaining variables for any particular behavior, whether it be problem behavior or adaptive behaviors. But typically, when we conduct an FBA, we are conducting an FBA to identify the function of a problem behavior that a person is engaging in. And these FBAs help us. There are different types of assessment methods that we can apply, but the FBAs help us to identify a hypothesis of the potential variables that are controlling that behavior and to identify some relations about the specific environmental events that are occurring prior to the behavior, so those antecedents, and to identify information about the consequences that are maintaining that behavior, okay? And FBAs are typically warranted when we have some persistent behavior or some severe maladaptive behavior or problem behavior that a person engages in. And I would say it's also warranted when you have some intervention that you've tried out, maybe you've tried out some interventions for a particular behavior and it's been ineffective. Maybe you want to reassess the behavior. Maybe the function of the behavior has changed. And so that would be another time to conduct a functional behavior assessment again. The expected outcomes, as I've mentioned, of a functional behavior assessment are to identify the function of the behavior and then to develop function-based interventions. And function-based interventions are those interventions that are guided by our results of our functional behavior assessment. So we're not just going in blind and implementing some particular intervention and hoping that it modifies the behavior, but rather we are addressing the function of the behavior and trying to mitigate, maybe change certain variables in the environment so that we can mitigate that function or satisfy that function in some other way. So you might be asking yourself, well, a few weeks ago we learned about behavioral assessment and then now we're learning about functional behavior assessment. It sounds very similar. What's the difference? Well, there's a very minor difference between these two different assessments, but they are distinctly different. And I want to clarify that for you. So behavioral assessments is kind of like an umbrella term. Behavioral assessments is basically some systematic assessments that we engage in as behavior analysts that encompass all types of methods to understand behavior. These are those assessments that I mentioned that will help us to understand the skills that a particular client has in their repertoire, or the particular maladaptive behaviors that a client engages in. And we use methods such like indirect assessments or the direct assessments. You're going to see that the functional behavior assessments are very similar, but functional behavior assessments are considered a subset of behavioral assessments. So like I mentioned, behavioral assessments are like the umbrella term, and it includes all the different types of assessments that we can conduct. And then FBAs are one type of assessment that we can conduct. So for example, in behavioral assessment, you can conduct a social skills assessment. You can conduct a communications assessment. You can conduct interviews. You can, the behavioral assessment includes a large variety of assessments, whereas the functional behavior assessment is a systematic assessment method where we exclusively focus on identifying the function of problem behavior. That is the main focus in a functional behavior assessment or in an FBA. Whereas in the behavioral assessment, that's not necessarily the case. We're just trying to identify certain patterns of behavior or environmental influences on a particular behavior. We're trying to identify, maybe interventions that could be effective for caregivers or certain things that we can modify in our environment that would help a particular client to gain skills. Or it's more broad and general. It's like we're trying to get a global perspective on the client and their needs, whereas the functional behavior assessment, we're focused exclusively on, identifying the function of specific problem behaviors. Okay, so now let's review. I just explained the difference to you, but I want to make sure that you grasp that difference. So which of the following statements best describes the difference between a behavioral assessment and functional behavior assessments? Answer option A says behavioral assessments focus on identifying the function of problem behavior, while FBAs address all patterns of adaptive and maladaptive behaviors. Answer option B says behavioral assessments broadly examine behavior patterns and environmental influences, while FBAs specifically target the function of problem behavior. Answer option C says behavioral assessment are a subset of FBAs that focus exclusively on problem behavior. And then answer option D says behavioral assessments and FBAs are identical. They both focus on identifying patterns of maladaptive behaviors. So please take a second to look over the question and select the answer option that you think is correct. Okay, so the correct answer here is B, which says behavioral assessments broadly examine behavior patterns and environmental influences, while FBAs specifically target the function of problem behavior. Okay, so now let's review those different FBA methods that you would engage in or conduct when you are conducting a functional behavior assessment. So The first method is an indirect method, and that is going to be really similar to those indirect methods that we talked about with behavioral assessment, with the exception that you would use indirect methods or indirect assessments that are very specific to the function of behavior. Okay, so when conducting an FBA, we will conduct interviews, we may conduct questionnaires, we may have, the client or caregivers or stakeholders fill out rating scales, etc. But they're going to be focused on the function of identifying the function of a particular behavior or hypothesizing the function of a particular behavior, okay? So, the interview, for example, you may ask questions such as, tell me what problem behavior Johnny engages in, or in what context do these behaviors occur? Please describe the what happens usually prior to the behavior. Please describe what happens after the behavior, etc. Then we have our descriptive analyses, which is when we are going to directly observe the behavior and collect data on the particular behavior to get a sense for the antecedents and the consequences that are occurring, in relation to the behavior. And then what we do is we analyze those antecedents and those consequences to paint a picture of what the potential function of the behavior can be. And then finally, we have our functional analyses, or FAs. And you might hear instead of functional analyses, you might hear these referred to as experimental analyses. And that's because functional analyses or experimental analyses are the type of assessment within ABA where we identify the function of behavior through manipulation of some variable we manipulate the antecedents and we manipulate the consequences to see if we can evoke the behavior, to get a sense for under which conditions does the behavior occur most often. I'll go over this in more detail, but in the experimental analysis or functional analysis, we do manipulate specific variables. We're not simply observing the behavior in its natural environment, but rather we are trying to see what those cause and effect relationships are. So what is the big idea, right? What's the big picture? Why are we conducting FBAs? How do we use FBAs? And what can we expect from them, okay? And that's what we'll discuss in the next few slides. So what is the role of FBAs in intervention and prevention? Well, FBAs are, like I mentioned, we're going to work on identifying the function of the behavior, and then that function of the behavior we will use to guide us through identifying effective and ethical interventions. Once we know the function of behavior, we should be working to identify function-based interventions. So let's look at what that may look like. The process in an FBA will look like this. First we'll gather information within the indirect and descriptive assessments to get a general sense for what the behavior looks like, under what context does it occur. We'll conduct our descriptive assessments. Basically, the indirect assessment we're using to get information about the behavior, the context under which it occurs, and we're going to use this information to guide us through when we should go and observe the behavior. So for example, if during the indirect assessment, a caregiver tells us that the behavior most likely occurs, after lunchtime, and it mostly occurs when, when grandma is home, then we will try to set up an observation period to see the behavior and collect data on the behavior. But we're going to try to set up that observation time during a time when the caregiver told us the behavior is most likely to happen. So if it's after lunch and when grandma is there, then that's when we will schedule our observation. And this indirect assessment component is important because if you don't have information on when the behavior is most likely to occur and least likely to occur, then you may be potentially wasting resources. You might go out to the client's home or to their school or to their workplace to observe the behavior, and then you don't see anything. And that is a waste of time, a waste of resources, and also time that client could have been getting support with their particular behavior, and that family could have been getting support with their particular behavior. Okay, so the first step in the FBA process is to gather information. And that, like I mentioned, that's done through the indirect assessment and the descriptive assessments. Then we will interpret the information from those two assessments, and we're going to formulate a hypothesis about what could be the purpose of the problem behavior. Okay, this is not giving us a concrete answer or a concrete answer on what the function of the behavior is, but we could formulate a hypothesis. Okay, we're getting some correlational data from the descriptive assessment, and we can see that, you know, when a particular antecedent is presented, the behavior occurs, and then, you know, X, Y, and Z is the consequence that typically follows. And then we can analyze that data, and we can say, you know what, I think the function of the behavior is to gain attention from the caregivers. And so after we have formulated a particular hypothesis, then we can test that hypothesis using a functional analysis. And that functional analysis is the one that I mentioned, where we experimentally manipulate the antecedents and the consequences to see under which condition is the behavior most likely to occur. And that's how we will determine what the function of the behavior is. Then next, what we do is we develop interventions based off of the function. So this functional analysis is going to give us a very clear understanding of, or should give us, it doesn't always happen, but it's out of the different FBA methods, it's the one that's most likely to give us a clear indication of what the function of the behavior is. Okay, so once we know the function of the behavior, we develop an intervention based off of the function, and then we are going to, this is no longer part of the FBA process, but we will implement our intervention, and then we'll monitor progress to ideally see a reduction in that behavior. The implementing of the intervention and monitoring progress, like I mentioned, is not part of the FBA process, but it's what we hope to achieve by implementing an FBA. So I just wanted to include that in here so that you can get an understanding for, you know, what does this all look like? What does this lead to, and how do we tie it all together? So as I just mentioned, once we've identified the function of a behavior, we want to implement function-based interventions, or we want our FBA results to inform the interventions that we are developing, right? And so what does that mean? Okay, when we conduct our FBA, you'll see this in the next few slides because I'll break this down further for you, but when we conduct our FBA, we are getting a sense for the antecedents and the consequences that are contributing to the behavior. And you know, when we identify the function of a behavior, that basically means that we've identified the consequences that are maintaining that behavior. So once we know the consequences that are maintaining the behavior, we can make modifications to the consequence in the future to be able to reduce that particular behavior, or to modify that behavior in whichever way we need it to be modified, right? So we can alter the consequent variables in the future in order to potentially reduce that behavior. But we can also modify the antecedents, and by modifying the antecedent, we can also produce behavior change, because we're able to then prevent the behavior in some way, or make it less likely for the behavior to occur. So our our function-based interventions will be likely to include these three components: some form of modifying the antecedent or altering the antecedent variables, some form of consequence strategies, and then we will also likely be teaching alternative behaviors to the problem behavior that client is engaging in. So now let's review what that process might look like. So I mentioned that we would first conduct an indirect assessment. So our indirect assessment, which is where we get an understanding for the potential environmental variables that are contributing to the behavior. We get an understanding for the context under which the behavior is occurring. And then after that, we can conduct our descriptive assessments. This is where we are observing the behavior and trying to see what the antecedents and the consequences that are maintaining the behavior are. Okay, and if you recall, as I just mentioned in the previous slide, you learned about A, B, and C's, or the three-term contingency in EAB 3002. Our antecedents refer to exactly what is occurring prior to a behavior. And we want to get an understanding for what occurs prior to a behavior, because these can serve as triggers in a sense for the behavior. The antecedents are typically they can be SDs, for example, that are signaling to us if we engage in the behavior now, then we'll get some form of reinforcement. And so the antecedents are in some way signaling that they could engage in the behavior. So we want to modify our antecedents in some way, but during the descriptive assessment process, all we're doing is collecting data on the antecedents of the behavior. Then we are clearly writing out what the behavior is. We're writing it out in measurable and observable terms. And this is where that target behavior definition is going to be really important, so that you know exactly what behavior you're collecting data on. And then here you probably write information also about, obviously what the behavior looks like. But if you're also looking at a behavior like a tantrum, you might want to write information on the duration of the tantrum, things like that. And then finally, the consequence is what happens directly after the behavior. And this is from the perspective of the person engaging in the behavior. And we want to also analyze not just what exactly does that consequence look like, but what could the person be getting from it? What could the person be gaining from engaging in this particular behavior? And the more data we collect, the clearer it becomes what the potential consequence that's maintaining the behavior could be. And sometimes it's not very clear. So here's an example of what this would look like. And on this particular slide, the resource that I pulled this ABC table from is a resource that was developed for teachers. And I want to clarify that, as I've mentioned before, as behavior analysts, we don't only work in school settings, and we don't only work with children. We can work with any population in really any setting. We can work in sports management. We can work in business settings. We can work with young people, children, elderly people. And so, it's not restricted to what you see in my slides or in my presentations. This one talks about students and a teacher, but that's not the only setting that you can conduct an ABC descriptive assessment in. And I also want to mention, I'm showing you what a descriptive assessment could look like. But this is just one form of descriptive assessment. You're going to learn more about how to conduct these descriptive assessments in a future course, and you will get hands-on practice with, conducting one of these ABC recordings. And there are also different forms of doing this particular assessment, but this is just one sample, so you can get a sense for what that FBA process would look like. Okay, so here's an example of what you would write down. So in the antecedents, you would write, a teacher hands out a math worksheet with word problems. Let me break this down even further. You would, for example, be sitting in the classroom with the teacher and the student, and you would simply be observing the student. And when they engage in an instance of problem behavior, you're going to write down exactly what happened right before that behavior, what happened right after the behavior, and what did the behavior look like. So in this case, the first instance of behavior was this. The behavior was a student said that he won't do the work and calls the teacher a name. So the observer saw this behavior and they wrote down the antecedent and the consequence. So the antecedent was the teacher hands out a math worksheet with word problems. The behavior was that the student said he was not going to do the work and he called the teacher a name, an inappropriate name, and then the consequence was that the teacher sent the student out of the room into a different room. And we can analyze this consequence and the antecedent, and you'll be able to see that during the antecedent, the teacher provided an instruction to complete work, right? They provided a worksheet, and the worksheet was potentially maybe a difficult worksheet. It included word problems, and the child engaged in a particular behavior of name calling and task refusal, and then what resulted was that the work was removed, okay, and the child was sent out of the room. So the child essentially gets to avoid completing the math worksheet, and and they don't have to be in the classroom anymore, so they don't have to participate in other classroom activities. And this is a form of social negative reinforcement. So if we were to observe this behavior, multiple times, we could see that if the consequence is consistent and the antecedents are consistent, we could get a sense for why the behavior is occurring. So the behavior is occurring each time that a maybe difficult worksheet is presented, and what typically happens is they're sent out of the room, so they get to avoid completing the worksheet. So we can say that the behavior is maintained by avoidance, or we can hypothesize that the behavior is maintained by avoidance. This is just one example. We would have to collect data consistently on the behavior, and we would probably also have to conduct a functional analysis to really confidently say that's the function of the behavior. Another instance here, another example here could be this example of behavior, which is a peer refuses to let the student join in their game, so the student cries and yells, and the consequence is that the teacher comes over and problem solves for the student. Maybe that looks like they allow the student to participate in the game, right? They help the student out with the peers. And so this behavior, if we were to observe this behavior multiple times and see consistent antecedent and consequence events, then we can say that the behavior is occurring, or the function of the behavior is to gain adult attention in the form of help. And so then once we know the function of the behavior, we have an understanding of those antecedents that are contributing to the behavior, and then the consequences that are maintaining the behavior. And so we can then implement a particular intervention to reduce this behavior. We can modify the antecedents, as I mentioned earlier in another slide. We can modify the antecedents and the consequences, and then assess their effects on the behavior. And this is what that would look like. So we can make a modification to the antecedent of a particular behavior, and that is what we call an antecedent manipulation. So we are simply altering whatever is occurring prior to a behavior in order to essentially prevent the behavior. Let's look at a little bit more about what an antecedent manipulation is. So an antecedent manipulation is basically after we've identified those particular antecedents that are contributing to the behavior or making the behavior more likely to occur. Well, we want to reduce that, right? We want to make it less likely for the behavior to occur. So we'll kind of modify those particular variables in order to make it less likely for that behavior to occur. So we might end up modifying the setting event, right? Like if you'll learn about setting events, but if there's a particular setting event in place, like the person is tired, well, then maybe we can offer an opportunity for them to rest before we conduct a session, or maybe we will cancel the session just to make it less likely for them to engage in problem behavior, because there's something already going on in their environment that's it's essentially like a trigger. It's gonna make it more likely for them to engage in behavior. We can also modify the MO for the problem behavior, or try to reduce the MO for a problem behavior, right? We want to make it less likely for them to have a need to engage in that particular behavior. And I have other examples on this slide, but let's say that a person is hungry prior to starting a session. If you know that they haven't eaten and they're hungry, they're going to want to seek out food, and maybe you're targeting the behavior of elopement. Well, let's just provide an opportunity for them to eat prior to getting started, or provide food throughout the session so that they can just continue to basically you're trying to satisfy that motivation for the problem behavior so that they're not likely to engage in the problem behavior. We're trying to reduce the likelihood of that behavior. And then we also want to reduce SDs, or remove SDs that evoke the behavior. And those SDs are what we previously learned are signals that are likely to, they let you know that reinforcement is available for engaging in a behavior. So if we have these SDs present in our environment, then we're likely to, and if MO is also present, then we are likely to want to engage in a particular behavior. So we want to reduce or remove the SDs that evoke behavior. And I have some examples of what this could look like. But the idea with antecedent manipulations is that we want to prevent maladaptive behaviors by, again, making it less likely for that behavior to occur, or like we want to remove the need for them to even engage in that problem behavior by satisfying their particular needs in some way, in some other way. And this is considered, antecedent manipulations are considered a form of proactive strategy to managing challenging behavior. Rather than waiting for them to engage in behavior and then, treat the behavior and modify the consequences. Instead, we're trying to teach them new skills, maybe make it less likely for them to engage in a behavior. Okay. And then the important thing is that antecedent manipulations are implemented independent of the problem behavior. You don't need to wait for a problem behavior to occur to implement an antecedent intervention. Antecedent interventions or manipulations can be done in different ways. And as I just mentioned in the previous slide, 2 of those ways could be manipulating motivational variables or manipulating SDs, or we can try to reduce setting events, but we can also try to make the target behavior more or less effortful, and which direction we choose is going to depend on the target behavior itself. We can also try to train an alternative behavior. So typically when we are targeting a behavior for reduction, we also try to select a replacement behavior that is going to be less effortful for the person to engage in, and also we want the replacement behavior to be one that contacts reinforcement so that they are more likely to engage in this replacement behavior rather than the problem behavior. We can also modify the consequences for responding. So we can, let's say, increase the rate of reinforcement for engaging in an appropriate behavior or engaging in the behavior under an appropriate context, and then reduce maybe the reinforcement for the behavior in when we're modifying the consequence strategies. So basically we would just try to provide more reinforcement for an alternative behavior, making it less likely for them to want to engage in the problem behavior. And then we can finally modify the environment in such a way where the opportunities to engage in the behavior are restricted. And I have some examples on the next slide for what that could look like, as well as some of these other antecedent strategies that we talked about. So let's look at some examples of antecedent strategies. Let's say that you have a client that's engaging in a throwing of objects let's say in a classroom setting, and it could potentially hurt peers. Well, we can modify the physical environment to make it less likely for them to gain access to those items with such ease. So you can basically remove items from within reach that are items that client can throw. So these are simple changes to the physical environment that you can produce. Or let's say that you have a client that is maybe talking excessively in a classroom. I'm sure you've seen this before, but when I was younger, for example, if we had a student in the class that would speak too much, they would be moved to next to the teacher. This is a simple change in the environment that would make it less likely for that child to speak excessively to their peers and disrupt maybe the classroom activities or the lectures, etc. We can also increase predictability. What this might mean is simply, letting the person know what's coming ahead of time. With my own child, for example, letting him know what we're going to do in a few minutes really helps prepare him for what's coming. And then once we are going to engage in that particular behavior, that it's a behavior that maybe he doesn't like to engage in, he's more likely to engage in it because I've set him up by providing warnings. An example of this could be, we have to turn off the TV in 5 minutes because we're going to go to the grocery store. And turning off the TV is maybe one of those antecedents that typically triggers problem behavior. If I were to just, turn off the TV randomly, then he might engage in a tantrum, understandably so, right? Nobody likes their TV to be abruptly turned off. So what I can do, a simple antecedent manipulation that I can implement, is to make it more predictable for him. Let him, make him aware of when I am going to remove the TV or turn off the TV. And so I'll let him know in advance, hey, we have 5 more minutes left with the TV. And then when we're getting closer, I'll let him know we have 2 minutes left. Or I'll try to, rather than making it based off of minutes, I might say when we get to the end of this video, we're turning off the TV. There are different ways, depending on the behavior of concern and the antecedents that are, contributing to the behavior, there are different ways that we can increase predictability. But increasing predictability can often help to prevent a behavior from occurring. You can also do pre-activity preparation. So if you know that there's a particular trigger for a behavior, you can have the client engage in maybe selection of choice for an activity. Let's say that we're gonna do a worksheet, okay, and there are multiple worksheets that we can choose from. A simple pre-activity preparation that we can engage in is have the client choose which worksheet they prefer to complete, and that simple choice, providing that simple choice, is likely to reduce the child engaging in problem behavior, or the client engaging in problem behavior. We can provide visual supports for receptive language. So let's say that we have a client that's engaging in problem behavior when we present work to them, and we want them to be able to request help or request break. But those might not be skills that are strong enough in their repertoire. It might be difficult for them to remember. And so we want to provide some supports, some visual supports for them to remember that I can ask for these things. I can ask for a break. I can ask for help. And so we can maybe put a simple card on the table that says break, or a card on the table that says help. And then that prompts them. It's like it serves as a visual support to remind them you can ask for a break, you can ask for help. Rather than them engaging in problem behavior, they might see that visual and think, oh, let me ask for help. So again, the big idea with all of these is to just try to be proactive and try to reduce the likelihood of problem behavior. So what can I do in my environment to make it less likely for the behavior to occur, or to prepare this person for this, difficult expectation that we have of them, or this difficult behavior that they have to engage in. We're basically trying to identify those aversive activities that individuals have to engage in, and find ways to make it less aversive for them, and make them more accepting of what's to come. So we can provide visual schedules that let them know what's going to go on through what activities they can expect to do throughout the day, so that we can make things more predictable for them. We can provide transition warnings, as I mentioned earlier, that I do with my son. I let him know, we have 5 minutes left to do, to watch TV, and then we're going to do X, Y, and Z after. We have 2 minutes left. We have 1 minute left. We could provide choices, as I mentioned earlier. You can provide reinforcement non-contingently. So this looks like simply providing attention or providing escape without having any expectation of behavior. So if you have a child or a client that engages in a behavior for attention, well, then let's just give them give them tons of attention throughout the day. Let's try to satiate their need for attention, so that they're not engaging in problem behavior to gain attention. This is what we call non-contingent reinforcement. And it's not considered a consequence strategy, because it's something that we're manipulating in the environment prior to any behavior occurring, right? Prior to the problem behavior occurring, right? We don't need the behavior to occur to provide attention to the client. We're trying to make it so that there's really no need for you to engage in this problem behavior, because we're satisfying your need for attention, or your need for escape. Another example of this could be if you have a client that is engaging in problem behavior, let's say throughout work. There's the expectation to work for 30 minutes, but they're not even able to work for 5 minutes consistently. Well, we can provide non-contingent escape, which means that we can provide escape where it's not contingent on them engaging in any particular behavior. Okay, so our problem behavior, let's say. So they could be working for 2 minutes, and then, okay, you can, go get a break. You've been working so nicely, go get a break. And then you continue to provide, then they go back to work, and they work for another minute, and you provide a break. And you just providing breaks very frequently, so that there really is no need for them to engage in any form of problem behavior, because you are granting them that reinforcer that they were previously seeking out, You're providing it to them already in the environment. We can also modify or accommodate our demands. I think a great example of this is, if there's the expectation for somebody to, let's say, engage in some particular behavior, and that behavior is very difficult for them, we can simply make the behavior easier for them. An example of this is, let's say that I had the expectation for my son to get dressed completely independently, and that's very challenging for him, so he typically engages in problem behavior for it. This is hypothetical, this doesn't actually happen, but let's just say, well, I can say to him, you know what, I only need a simple antecedent manipulation would be to say, and this is independent of the behavior occurring, the problem behavior occurring, prior to any problem behavior occurring, I would say, you know what, for today, all you have to do is put one arm through the shirt. You don't have to put anything else on independently. I'm going to reduce the requirement so much so that he's able to contact reinforcement. So this is a form of modifying or accommodating the demands to meet our clients' individual needs. Another example would be to modify the presentation of demand, so we can change the pace. So how often we're presenting demands, we can make our demands more preferred rather than non-preferred. We can have them, engage in a little bit of work and then break, and then have a break, etc. And yeah, I think also teaching our clients replacement behaviors is very important. Teaching your client advocacy skills. These are not on this slide, but of course these are just some sample interventions. This isn't going to include everything, but I like to think of, whenever I work with a client, I feel like there's a basic set of skills that everybody should have, and those are advocacy skills. The individuals that we work with should be able to advocate for themselves, should be able to say, no, stop, I don't like that, I need a break, please give me more time. And so when we teach our clients these different skills where they're able to advocate for themselves, we're able to help them gain reinforcement by engaging in these appropriate alternative behaviors, and then that mitigates the need for them to engage in problem behaviors. So oftentimes when we teach simple advocacy skills, that also is a great antecedent strategy, and we're able to then reduce the likelihood of problem behavior occurring. So I gave plenty of examples of modifying antecedents, but we can also modify consequence strategies, or modify the consequences that occur following a behavior. And we can do it in such a way where we are working to decrease the behavior and reduce the behavior's likelihood of accessing reinforcement. So let's consider what this would look like with those ABCs that we were looking at previously. So, as I mentioned previously, for the antecedent, we would be modifying what occurs prior to a behavior, but rather when we're modifying the consequence for a behavior, we're going to be changing what happens after a problem behavior occurs. So let's review what consequences are. Consequences are those stimuli that are presented or removed contingent on an occurrence of the problem behavior. So if you recall, for antecedent strategies, I said the behavior does not need to occur. You don't need to you don't need to wait for the problem behavior to occur to implement an antecedent manipulation. Rather, what you should do, and what we do, is change certain environmental variables to make it less likely for the behavior to occur. Whereas with consequences, the consequence is always going to follow behavior. Always. So it's always going to be something that we modify following a problem behavior. Okay, so when we are altering our consequent variables, we're basically going to be changing or coming up with a strategy for how we want to intervene after the problem behavior occurs. And we do this to achieve a reduction in the occurrence of the problem behavior. The key here is identifying the function of the behavior so that we know what the source of reinforcement is, and we can eliminate the source of reinforcement for that behavior. Now, this is going to look very different for each particular behavior, because the strategy that you implement, the consequence strategies that you implement, are going to be guided by the function of the behavior. But let's consider the example that I provided previously of the child that is presented with work, then engages in problem behavior, says he doesn't want to, and he calls his teacher names, and then the teacher removes the work. That, if we were to conduct, our full descriptive assessment and our functional analysis, and we determine that the function of that behavior is to escape or avoid work, well, we can then implement our modify, the consequence strategies, right? We can implement our intervention, which can look like many different things, but one intervention that we could put in place, for example, would be to have the child request help with his work, or maybe the child can advocate for themselves and say, this is very difficult, can you please help me? Or can I do one and then take a break? The teacher can prompt them to engage in the work, right? There could be different strategies, and then they can provide reinforcement. But the idea is that we don't want the child to get access to avoid the demand or to escape the demand by engaging in the prompt behavior. If we can still give them the ability to escape or provide the ability to escape or avoid the behavior of completing the worksheet after they've engaged in some other form of appropriate behavior. That could be an example of what we might do. Or after they've completed a portion of the worksheet, for example. But we wouldn't want to provide escape contingent on them engaging in problem behavior. The consequence strategies is not something that we're going to review thoroughly right now, because you still have to learn a lot of different interventions throughout this course. But you will have an entire course dedicated to assessments and dedicated to intervention planning based off of your assessment results. So as I just mentioned, we can teach alternative behaviors when we are working with our clients to try to reduce the need for them to engage in the problem behavior. So we basically want to identify the source of reinforcement and have basically the alternative appropriate behavior that we're trying to teach, have them contact reinforcement through that appropriate alternative behavior. And since they're contacting reinforcement through that alternative appropriate behavior, then they don't have the need to engage in the maladaptive behavior. So an example of that I just gave was that we can teach the person that, that is presented with a demand that's too difficult. We can teach them to say, this is really hard, can you please help me? And through that behavior that they engage in, they will be likely to contact reinforcement. And so in the future, when they're presented with a demand, instead of engaging in problem behavior, they're more likely to request help because we've reinforced that behavior and we've stopped reinforcing the behavior of, saying that they don't want to and calling their teacher names. So we would like to shift I don't know what to call it. You want to basically shift reinforcement from the problem behavior over to the alternative behaviors that you're trying to teach.